Well, welcome to the Psalms and Proverbs. This will cover our mini lecture for this week on the story and structure of the Bible. One of the things that we need to think about is the relationship of the Psalms and the Proverbs together. Both have a particular direction, just like any of the narrative sections of the Old Testament and as you get into the New Testament as well. But let's consider the Psalms as a book of worship. It's also a book of instruction of how one should approach God. It speaks directly to our soul, and it's filled with all sorts of emotion, where the psalmist may be depressed, the psalmist might be filled with joy, excitement. He is seeking to know the Lord through worship. And so the worshiper is inclined to the heart of the Lord. And then as you consider the book of Proverbs, it's a book of wisdom or wise sayings. It speaks directly about what we're thinking upon or directly to our mind, filled with all sorts of teaching and instruction. It's not necessarily a book about promises, though there are statements about God's truth, and as one would apply it, would work out in that person's life. So these are wise sayings. So even though you might put it into practice, doesn't necessarily mean it will take place in your life. For example, one of the central proverbs is teaching the children the way that they should go, and when they are old, they shall not depart from it. Is again a wise saying. Doesn't mean your children won't depart from the precepts of Scripture. Just means that we would apply these truths in our lives. These are good words of God's promises, and yet they're filled with truth, and they're filled with practical guidelines that we can incline our mind toward. And so the worshiper is to love the Lord your God with all your heart, is really the kind intention of the book of Proverbs. And of course, there are more than we'll cover in this mini lecture. Now, one of the things I do enjoy about looking at others or other theologians as they consider the Old Testament, one particular helpful diagram comes from Walter von Brueggemann, who is a scholar of the Old Testament, particularly in his look at the Psalms. And I do find this diagram to be very helpful as I look at the book of the Psalm, the worship book of Israel. He frames it from this intention. He looks at each psalm as an orientation with God, so that the psalmist is looking at God's attributes, his character, his love. So God is faithful, God is all-knowing, God is powerful, he's filled with glory. And so the psalmist comes with a right frame of reference, a right spiritual direction. He knows the Lord. That's what he knows to be true about God. But then difficulty comes into his life and he is disoriented. He doesn't know what to think about. Maybe the situation is causing him vexation. His soul is deep. He's despondent. He's looking at a situation from a different perspective. Humanly speaking, he sees it as insurmountable. He doesn't know what to do. So his life is disoriented, he's troubled, he's unsettled in his own heart. And then the psalmist moves us to reorientation with the Lord. He brings us back to God's character, his attributes. Again, God is loving, God is faithful, he's compassionate, he's slow to anger, abounding in steadfast love, he's covenantal, he fulfills his promises in the life of God's people. So how the Psalms speak for us, this diagram helps frame majority of all the Psalms, and you can look at this as a helpful strategy for studying the Psalms and moving you forward in your study. Now, we want to consider the structures of the Psalm. So the Psalms are filled with many different ways of looking at it. You don't study necessarily like an epistle, a letter of Paul or John or Peter. The same way you would study the Psalms because of the poetic nature, the rhyme lines that it might take. And so we want to look at it more from a thematic level, but know how the divisions of the Psalm do take into account this Old Testament section of our Bible. So now as we consider the structure of the psalm, we know that the psalm is divided into 5 respective sections or 5 books. And this is helpful for us as a reader as we study and even consider the different themes and authors who are crafting these worshipful songs for the nation of Israel. Well, book 1 has 41 psalms, book 2, 31, book 3, 17, book 4 has 17, similar to book 3, and then lastly, book 5, we have a devoted of songs, about 44 there that are listed in your PowerPoint. And of course, I reference each of the sections of the books and their rightful place. You have a doxology, which concludes the books. And then you have Jewish tradition that align under each of these 5 books or sections of the Psalms, such as book 1 is devoted to the book of Genesis or creation. Book 2 is thinking about the Exodus or God's people leaving Egypt. And book 3 is Levitical, looking at the priestly function of those leaders worshiping the Lord and helping bring about the community back to God. And then the book of Numbers, if you look at it from the chronology of the nation, of the building up of God's people and the bringing of God's people into the land, and Deuteronomy closes out, which is part 5 of the Psalms. Then when you look at the authorship, you're mainly looking at what David writes in book 1, and then you have a combination author of the sons of Korah in book 2 with David, and then book 3 is Asaph. You have book 4, which is largely anonymous. We don't know who's writing that section, and then it concludes in book 5 with David again. Now the Psalms have its various literary types, and this is also important as you study it, knowing that even in a worshipful song or a song of worship, you have wisdom being applied, and I've referenced those sections of the psalm where we see those themes develop or at least spoken of. There's the royal psalms, and the royal psalms are speaking of God as King, the Lord. So these are messianic in nature, and so you can study those in view of Christ in the Psalms. Of course, there are laments where the songwriter is in a period of depression, deep sadness has overcome their life. There's imprecatory psalms, meaning the psalm wants justice. The psalmist wants God to act and deal justly with his enemies or bring about peace within the situation. There are psalms devoted to Thanksgiving. These are wonderful sections during the times, holiday months, where we're devoting our time to giving God thanks for the blessings that he's given to us. There are the pilgrim psalms, or the pilgrim wanting and desiring to be in God's tabernacle or longing to be in God's city, Jerusalem. And they are moving from exile back into the land of the promise, or the place of promise, of being with him as his people. And of course, similar to the royal psalms is the enthronement psalms, where the psalmist is praising God, giving praise, giving glory, exalting his name. And often those are all connected back to the messianic psalms of giving praise and glory to our great God. So let's consider now the Proverbs, which is our second section of this mini lecture. And the Proverbs are a section devoted to wisdom and giving wisdom to the reader. And so that is our intention, at least provide those themes here for our time together. Let's consider the structure of the Proverbs. It's helpful for us to know that each of the Proverbs begin with some sort of introduction or purpose, by which, in this case, Solomon is collecting these wise sayings to God's people. And this is in the time of Hezekiah's day. You have Agur, you have Lemuel a non-Israelite king. At those points, these words of wisdom are given. And so you have these two appeals to the youth, the accommodation and wisdom of plus folly, the warning against folly or acquiring folly in one's life. And so this sets the context of the book of Proverbs as we enter in. Of course, these are Solomon's words. He's asked God to give him divine wisdom. He's seeking this, and God kindly gives it graciously to him. And therefore, these become various sayings or collections from Solomon. And we also believe Solomon is not the only one writing this particular section. You'll later see a prayer from Agur, who's praying and asking God to reveal himself and provide only the things that he needs in this life. Of course, for whom and why is the book of the Proverbs written? Is it written for us? It was written for the nation. These are great questions. Again, these are wise sayings, and so we want to treat it as wisdom words that God gives to Solomon, who again gives it to us, the readers of the text today. And so these are simple, wise, and instruction words or words of teaching. And that's the point of chapter 1, verse 4. And then you move to chapter 1, verse 5, to make the wise even wiser is the kind of intention of this section of the Proverbs. Of course, you'll notice that there's some frequent address, meaning that it's written to a specific person in mind, and therefore you can make some practical application as well as the reader. And this would be the same for all of the biblical genres or the biblical books that are given to us in the Bible. You can simply make application. And of course, there are promises that are universal, apply for all times, and therefore we also make principles of application therein. But notice here is how Solomon prefaces the context of this section. It's my son. Listen, my son, your father's instruction, and do not forsake your mother's teaching. Chapter 1, verse 10, my son is a sinner, entice you, do not give to them. Notice verse 15, my son, do not go along with them, do not set foot on their path. So again, wise words, wise instruction. My son, if you accept my words and store up my commands within you. And then chapter 3, verse 1, my son, do not forget my teaching, but keep my commands in your heart. So the context is to a son from a father. A father's wise instruction given to his son. Of course, the Proverbs sets out to gain wisdom through reason. And so we're speaking about the mind. Of course, also the heart is mentioned in this section as well. The value of instruction or receiving these wise words. And then the passing on wisdom to others, such as this is very practical, it's very instructional as we apply these wise words. Now, there are some other wisdom books or wise words given to the author, such as Job and Ecclesiastes, are speculative and also philosophical in thought, especially Ecclesiastes, thinking about the end of life and the end of day and everything under the sun. But nonetheless, there are wise words, wise sayings that we should heed and at least consider and reflect upon. And then you have the Song of Songs, which addresses choices in the context of love, or in this case, marriage, love that we have between a man and a woman. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. You'll see that as a reoccurring theme. It's characteristic of biblical wisdom, the need for practical advice or the need for observation of behavior that one is observing and one is seeking wisdom. Of course, there's the wrestling of unanswered questions that go along with some of these proverbs. And so the goal then is to gain wisdom and to refrain ourselves from folly. It's simply what the author is seeking to do. This wisdom is the discipline of applying truth to one's life in the light of experience, as Gordon Fee demonstrates in his book, How to Read the Bible for All It's Worth. And of course, one could be foolish and eventually is then a deliberate rejection of God's command in their life. And so it's to gain wisdom is then to refrain from folly. There's general structure of the book of Proverbs. Again, going back to chapter 1, setting the pace for our mini lecture here, is that you have a father's praise of instruction and teaching, with the distinction between wisdom and folly, which then covers from chapter 1 all the way to 9. Then you have individual sayings, these wise words, in chapter 10 all the way to chapter 22 as our framing of our structure of this book. The saying of the wise then appears in chapter 22, and that will take us all the way to chapter 24, verse 34. Of course, there are the collection of Solomon's Proverbs edited by the time of Hezekiah, or in the times of Hezekiah. And then you have supplemental words from Agur and Lemuel in chapter 25 to 31. Now, some scholars might see Lemuel as actually being Solomon, or maybe another word for him, or even looking at Agur as possibly written by Solomon himself. But again, note the differences of opinion on that as you look at commentaries and those scholars that write on the book of Proverbs. So consider embracing wisdom, coming from chapter 4, verses 5 through 9. Wisdom protects and wisdom guides. The writer says here that get wisdom and get insight, and do not forget, and do not turn away from the words of my mouth. Verse 7, the beginning of wisdom is this: get wisdom, and whatever you get, insight, prize her highly, and she will exalt you, and she will honor you if you embrace her. And so here's the idea that as Solomon is writing these wise words, and the father is instructing his child or his son, that the son would actually indeed get wisdom because it protects and it guides them in their life. So there are types of fools or foolishness as Proverbs identifies. The simple person might be considered a fool or foolish, the one who is dull or obstinate, the one who is morally insolent or stubborn in his ways, meaning going after, not listening to the truth or in the wise instruction from a father, the one who is a brute or godless, closed in mind, and the one who mocks God would be considered types of a fool or foolishness in our life. And then lastly, as we consider one of the wise words of looking at the power of the tongue has the power of life and death in chapter 18. Words penetrate our life. They are reckless words like a sword, so they dig deep into our hearts, and they spread. They're like a scorching fire in chapter 16. You know, James, the epistle of James, picks up these themes. And this is why scholars often attribute James as a proverb, right? He picks up many of the Proverbs themes in his letter to the Jerusalem church. Well, this ends our mini lecture. I hope you find it at least resourceful as you work through this week's content and even your discussion thread.